Hi, we're Ralph and Lahni D'Amicus, authors of the Planetary Calendar and other astrology and feng shui related books. And we're here with our much awaited annual
Yes.
forecast based on the Chinese New Year chart. We've been doing this global forecast based on that Chinese New Year chart now for about, 15 years?
More like 20 years.
Closer. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? And we chose this date after a lot of research and pondering. We chose the date because it is a more clear and logical marker for the beginning of a new cycle, right?
Yes.
I mean, the arbitrary date of January 1st only happened because somebody wanted to monkey around with the calendar.
Yes.
But if you really live by the seasons and the energetic flow on the earth and with the planets, you realize that in January at the new moon, which is what defines the Chinese New Year,
Right.
although on calendars it's mostly put on the next full day after the full moon happens, but we really calculate the chart just for the full moon, right? And so when it is the new moon in Aquarius, both the moon and the sun are in Aquarius, which is the opposite of Leo.
Yes.
The sun rules Leo
Yes.
and gets to be most sun-like in Leo. And so it stands to reason that it's the opposite of being the most sun-like in Aquarius. So it's a time where energy isn't really emanating out. It's been withdrawing ever since that new moon in Leo.
Yes. But it is the time in which, after the new moon in Aquarius, when the seeds begin to sprout. They're still buried in the ground, but their little spark of life starts to begin after that. And this is why the Chinese actually call this, the Asians call this the springtime festival.
Right.
Because it's the beginning of the growing cycle. We, astrologically, in the West, tend to think of the first day of spring as being the first degree of Aries. But that's actually the point when the first sprouts are now showing above the ground.
Right.
Well, they've been working under the ground for a while now. And the big difference between the Western cultures and the Asian cultures in terms of that is the crops in which they use. The West tends to be a dry crop culture, like with wheat and such. We're waiting for those sprouts to show up. The Chinese are a rice culture. They're thinking about when it's still under the ground. It's a earth-based culture underneath the water.
Well, I was just thinking about the fact that Aquarius is a fixed sign. So all in the fixed signs, things are happening, but they're not so obvious, And then when you go into the cardinal sign of Aries, then all of a sudden you get to see what's been going on under the surface for all that time.
Exactly. And think of the fact that Aquarius is the water pourer. It's the person who irrigates. Well, a major portion of what's involved in rice is actually taking place in the off season when they go in and they correct the pools. And rice is a very labor intensive type of work, but in a very small area. So you produce much more crop in a smaller area, but it's very work intensive. And it's actually the big difference between the Western culture and the Asian cultures, in that the Western culture has this long period of time when you kind of camp out and wait over the winter time. But in the Asian cultures, the winter time is spent repairing the pools, moving things around. And it's a very active time. This is one of the reasons why the Asians are geared to working 365 days a year, because they are a rice crop culture.
It is kind of like the wine industry, though, because we've got the grapes always need something to be done, right?
That's true.
So there's all year round. There's never a slow season in terms of work to be done in the vineyard.
Exactly. You get a little bit of time right after Christmas when you get to relax, and then you're back to work out there pruning. So we're looking at the new moon in Aquarius. And preparing this is a whole process. So we're going to actually explain it to you on two levels. The one level is for anyone who is interested in the future, which I guess it's like, who's not? The other one is for people who actually have some astrological knowledge. So we're going to explain it on both levels. So when we get to the astrological knowledge, if you're not that astrologically savvy, bear with us.
Be patient.
Okay? Now, the new moon in Aquarius in 2021, which is the metal ox, by the way, which is generally seen as a fortunate year, especially for business, is on February 11th, 2021. 12:51. In Washington, D.C., it was at 2:05 p.m. EST. On the West Coast, because we do the chart for both coasts, it is at 11:05 a.m. PST. The thing about the United States is that it has two major coasts, two very different cultures. And you know from experience that if you lived in both places, the experience on one coast is very different year to year than the experience on the other coast.
That's what I was thinking about saying, is the fact that we do calculate for both sides of the United States, because we've lived in Philadelphia and we've lived in California, and everyone has heard that, the lifestyle is very different on each coast, and we can testify to that because, it is extremely different. So it's a matter of perception, and it's also going to be a matter of house emphasis about where this lunation takes place and what planets occupy the houses.
Now, we've been doing, as Lahni said, these forecasts for many years, and we found that they're very accurate. But realize the accuracy in astrology is very much like in demographics. You can kind of count up all the people and get a sense of where they're going to go, but you can't necessarily say what one person is going to do.
Right.
And we have learned from experience, and we talked about this in our episode about when we forecast the 2020 election, and that we forecasted accurately, was that the big mistake we had made in 2016 was not looking at the next year. So we actually calculated the charts from 2021 out to 2030, just so we wouldn't have any surprises. So we actually looked at all that.
He does have 3 planets in Virgo, and I have Capricorn rising, so we are really steeped in the details. So.
Right. And when we don't, in 2016 was the first forecast for an election we hadn't gotten right. And since we started doing this with the Chinese New Year. And the thing about the Chinese New Year is it will show major themes that take place around the planet, depending upon where you are. So we're going to be using astrocartography in this because we're going to talk about what's happening in different places. Though we are going to focus mostly on the United States, which is actually where everything is happening this year.
It's interesting that you say that, because in previous years, all of the planetary action was overhead in other parts of the world. Right. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at an astrocartography map, is one of the many charts that you see, is an astrocartography map that shows us where the actual planetary body was overhead. So whatever planet was overhead at that very moment of that new moon in Aquarius, and those lines that are described all over the planet emanating from the direction of that planet will give color the experience or the occurrences, the events, the happenings that will be the types of events that will be affecting that country. And so in past years, recent past years, all the planets have been in other parts of the world.
Yes.
And this year, everybody's here. They all came home. So instead of kind of sitting back and waiting, how many of us have been feeling like we're waiting for something? Yes. We're waiting for something to change or something to click or something to activate. This is the year.
In fact, when we did the forecast for the election, we looked at these charts and we said, America's back. And then after we said that, Joe Biden got on the TV and said, America's back. And I thought, he stole our line.
He listens to what we say.
He does. It's amazing how many times they do. So why are we saying that? Because in the astrocartography, the major number of planets, the visible planets, those are the ones people notice, are over the United States. And what's amazing about this chart is how simple it is. I mean, it's hard to miss what it's saying. And the reason is that at the Chinese New Year, which is, the new moon in Aquarius, when the moon and the sun are in Aquarius, right? What else is in Aquarius? Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. Okay? The only visible planet, that's the ones you can see without a telescope, that's not in Aquarius is Mars. And Mars is in Taurus, the sign of the Earth. It's also in the same sign as the planet Uranus in Taurus, which can be seen sometimes. Right about at the time of the inauguration, they were conjunct. Now, what's interesting about this is that in California, the rising setting is Taurus, Scorpio. Okay? Which is interesting. It's especially interesting because that is the sun-moon position of Joe Biden. So California on the West Coast, they're going to be very, very much with his agenda, which, considering how the vote went, is not surprising.
Well, and I think that, it highlights the fact that the environment is a big concern of his, and California has been known to be at the forefront of environmental protections for many, many years.
In fact, that's one of our big challenges we're going to be having on the West Coast, is that at the rising, in other words, that's what's in front of our face, is going to be the Mars, which is hot. Maybe we say Mars is too hot, in Taurus, the sign of the Earth, loosely conjunct Uranus, sudden changes and technology, the electrical grid, at the rising. So we're going to be very conscious once again in California and all along the West Coast of fires.
Yes, unfortunately, but the that Uranus also is things like solar technology, battery technology, wind technology, all those kinds of alternative things, which Uranus highlights very much. And in the sign of Taurus, of course, it has to do with the Earth.
Exactly. Now, the saving grace in this is that all this stuff up in Aquarius, which is all about responsibility and leadership, is in the 10th house, the house of visibility and leadership. And what's interesting, the line that goes right down through California is Saturn. It's about being responsible to the community in Aquarius, a rulership position, a very positive extrovert rulership position. What's real interesting is there's what's called a quintile. A quintile is the degree of the goddess, 72 degrees. It's about creativity. It goes between the sun and the moon and Uranus. So it is about using creativity for the common good, which is a positive outlook. The fact that Venus and Jupiter are conjunct in the same degree in Aquarius, once again, people are going to be very, very much behind this. It means money is going to be behind it. Money is going to get invested in this. So we're going to see a lot of money invested in technology to take responsibility for the environmental issues, which, pretty good message there.
Well, and all of that 10th house emphasis, anyone with a natal 10th house emphasis or primary personal planets in that 10th house, nothing is hidden from the world.
No.
It's all out in that light of high noon for the world to see. And so I don't think it's unusual, but California is going to be pretty noisy about all of these technological and financial and environmental issue and these ideas that come out of that brilliant Mercury in Aquarius up in that 10th house. Those ideas, you can expect to see a lot of new ideas come out of the tech world based in California.
And look at it, it's retrograde, so it means they're going to be pulling up stuff they talked about before. Remember, during the Obama administration, there was a big push towards sustainable energy. That was the founding of the Paris Accord. They're going back to that. That Mercury retrograde means we're going back. We have this technology. We're moving forward with it. And Mercury is conjunct, is kind of like the linchpin here, because it's conjunct all the way back to Saturn in one direction and all the way up to the sun and the moon in the other direction. It really commands that. And the thing about Mercury and Saturn, they're both in what's called extrovert rulership positions. So they have a lot of leverage.
And I just want to mention that we're not usually this political in our annual forecast, but the politics and the governmental issues are so in the forefront here, we can't ignore them. And the messages from the planetary configurations at this new moon, which sets the tone for the whole year, is just something that we can't ignore. So
yeah, and also the two planets that are most angular in this, are Saturn, which is within 3 degrees of the midheaven, and Mars on the west coast. So they're both angular. In fact, the Mars is especially powerful. Well, when Mars or Saturn are involved, it means you're dealing with reality. You're dealing with, what's going to catch fire? What do we have to do to the grid? What do we have to do? Where do we have to invest money? What action do we have to take in terms of creating a more positive future?
Well, and I also like that Neptune in the 11th house.
Mm,
The 11th house being the global community or the broader community. It's usually ruled by Aquarius, so there's that Aquarius influence. But that Neptune in Pisces is also part of this big idea
yeah.
configuration. So there's a lot of not just ideas, but idealism
Mm,
that is evident in this more global community as the secondary influence after all that Aquarian energy is shaking things up.
yeah. I think what's interesting is how different it is from the East Coast to the West Coast.
Absolutely.
Because when you go to
Let's
the
go
East
there. Let's
Coast,
fly on a little imaginary
I
plane,
mean,
and we're on the East Coast now.
exactly. So we charted it for Washington, D.C., but we sometimes use Philadelphia since that's where the original docs were signed. The Sun and Moon, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn are all in the eighth house now, the area of collective power. The eighth house relates to Scorpio, coincidentally, the son of Joe Biden, and he actually has a stellium in Scorpio. We did a portrait of him earlier in the year of Joe Biden and James Polk, that there are two Scorpio presidents who both were lifelong politicians who Polk accomplished amazing things during his 4 years in office. Chose not to run a second time.
And so the rising is Cancer
Mm,
rising for the East Coast, which is interesting because, it kind of looks like home,
mm.
family. It's the United States birth chart is in
Yes,
Cancer.
13
And
degrees.
so it's again coming back to the sort of original intent, if you take it from the government point of view, coming back to the original intent to take care of the people and live up to the promises made in the Constitution and the Declaration. And so that's right in the forefront. And then there's nothing below the horizon
No.
whatsoever. It's all in that eighth house of hidden power or the power of the small. Like many people don't realize that when you go to vote, you are participating in an eighth house function because it's the power of the small being able to affect the larger.
And now the square that goes on, because realize this is a square, it's a year for accomplishing great things between all the stuff in Aquarius and the Uranus and Mars is from there to the 11th house, which is a house of change. Well, eighth house is a house of change, but it's a little bit like it could be surgery, it could be the use of power, it can be
Digging deep down to
power.
make fundamental
The
change.
fact it's all in Aquarius, which is in high visibility. One of the things we have said about this conjunction, this stellium as it's called, is there's a huge amount of light pouring in, huge amounts of visibility. And one thing that's been promised with this administration is tremendous transparency. Well, we're in a really unique time in terms of the government on the East Coast because a lot of older people have left the government. A lot of people were forced out. Well, now they're having to hire, and when they're hiring, who are they hiring? A lot of young people who are technically savvy.
Absolutely. That's the future.
Yeah. And at the same time, it goes back to that square in the 11th house where Mars is also young people. And government pays very well, not as well as the public sector, but it pays very steadily. Well, that's Taurus for you. Pay me a steady paycheck. I want a steady paycheck. I don't want the crazy. I'm okay with boring.
Well, and it's in the 11th house, the house of income earned, which is great.
Yeah.
A lot of people, you look at the second house for money,
Yeah.
but the second house is money that you get to keep. Money that flows into your life through work that you do only happens through your contacts with the community, whether the smaller community, larger, or global community. That's an 11th house thing. So income earned is the 11th house. Money saved is the second house. So when you've got this relationship between the second house and the 11th house, because of the fact
Yeah.
that Taurus is the ruler of the second
Yeah.
in the 11th,
Yes.
that looks like a stabilization of money and income for the greater group.
Now, one thing that's real interesting is on the West Coast, Saturn was at the midheaven. That's the line that goes right down through California. So it's about be responsible, work on maybe your power grid, work on your infrastructure grid, work on, as a collective group, like, get everyone involved. On the East Coast, what runs right down through Washington, D.C.? Neptune in Pisces, the big idea. But Neptune a lot of times also relates to how we envision our vision of the world. But it's a planet you cannot see without a telescope.
It's interesting. I remember having a conversation with somebody, another prominent astrologer, and we were talking about the significators of the government in the chart. And everybody in the group was kind of saying, well, Saturn is the government because it makes the rules and all that kind of stuff. And a few of us said, no, Neptune is the government because Saturn is about things that you can physically touch. It's density. It's established something. It's hard, it's firm, it's the bones in your body. But Neptune is more of a match for the government because where is the government? Can you go see the government? Can you hold it in your hand or can you look at it? Can you take a picture of it? It's this nebulous idea of a set of rules and guidelines and ideals, in fact, and it is a better fit to have a rulership of Neptune than Saturn, although there are Saturnine parts of the government.
Exactly. And one of the things that's powerful about this is it's going to take place behind the scenes. So as much as we're going to have a lot of visibility, they're going to be probably a little draconian in some ways. Like they'll take whatever actions they need to take. And the reason is because in that 8th house is Jupiter and Saturn.
Right.
In other words, they look at the rules and say, okay, as long as this is within the rules, we can do it, even though if we have to go dig into some rules that we don't usually use, they will find a way to move it along.
Well, and that's where that Neptune in Pisces visionary component comes in too, because they're going to be thinking outside of the box. They're going to have to find new ways of being. Even if you just change over a government, say from older rulership to bring more young people in it, you're going to have to find new ways to integrate that. And you're going to get these new inspirational ideas. And think about how many new young faces are in, the House and the Senate and
even in the White House, how many of the team? I mean, you have Joe Biden, the oldest president we've ever had, but his team, including his national security advisor, he's the youngest national security advisor ever to hold the post.
It's going to be interesting because this is definitely a transitional time because I think it's important, and I think that the chart bears it out as we're talking about, of integrating the old with the new to come up with a brand new kind of a thing. So we're in a transitional period where you don't want to throw away the old knowledge, but you don't want to shut out the new ideas.
Now, what's interesting, you have Neptune at the midheaven, right? Neptune, it's Pisces, so it also relates to the 6th house because it's Sagittarius. It relates to the 8th house because that's where Jupiter, the ruler, is. So you have that all, compassion work. But what's opposite the Neptune at the IC is Vesta in Virgo. And Virgo's all over the chart for Washington, D.C. and for the founding of the United States. In fact, all the major charts that relate to the founding of the United States of America and Washington, D.C. have Virgo all over it. And Vesta, the flame, is at the foundation. It's reigniting the light of what our mission was.
And although we use the asteroids a lot in our work, we were going to leave them largely out of this forecast, because a lot of people are not familiar with them or don't use them very well. But Vesta is an important one for us to know. It is,
it's bright.
It's like a super Virgo energy. It's like what you have, as you said, lit the flame for, like you're holding a candle for a memory of something, an ideal. Yes. And, this is an important player, the way the astrocartography and the way the chart falls here, especially in that sign of Virgo, which even amplifies that effect. So I think, again, talking about going back to what the founders believed
Yes.
and wanted, maybe some interpretation about that. It's in the third house in
Well,
the
what
Washington chart,
what
but
what what
so there'll be
Americans believe,
discussion.
our sense of
And what do we need
patriotism,
now?
and the way we're indoctrinated to it as children. When we stand up and pledge allegiance in school. I mean, how we're indoctrinated to our belief in this service to all, which is Virgo. Because remember, the only planet that's angular in this whole chart really is the Neptune, though the sun and moon are kind of, they're within that range. But Neptune is. In the other chart, it's Saturn and the West Coast, Saturn and Mars are the two angular ones, but Neptune really is the ruler here. It's really commanding the situation. What's real interesting, and I just want to make sure we cover this. This year, everything is over the United States. And it's funny because when you go around the planet, when we actually looked at like Russia, we looked at Saudi Arabia, we looked at those places, and we looked at there and realized that was one of the reasons why we knew that President Trump was not going to win, because his allies were not going to be doing well next year. They're more isolated. Next year, in 2022, all of the planets are on the other side of the planet. So we get what are called IC lines. America comes home to itself. Next year,
IC is your
yeah,
roots.
you're
Where
going to
you're
really,
grounded.
we're going to be focusing on our foundation next year. There's going to be a kind of a pulling in 2022. One more thing before we go. There was a fundamental shift that took place in the American timeline that happened with FDR. And the reason was that FDR changed the inauguration date. See, we take the chart for the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, and we put it onto the chart that we use for the United States, which is a little different from what other people use because we use a noontime chart. We find this more effective. Well, as a result, since it has a Libra rising, the inauguration, which takes place at the first degree of Aquarius now, is in the fifth house of the United States chart, which is the house of the leader, the sun, the king, the queen. Okay? It was in Pisces. It was originally that it was 120 degrees between inauguration to election day to July 4th.
All in water signs.
All in water signs. But it was such a long period of time between the two that FDR moved it from Pisces to Aquarius. Well, it moved the inauguration day from the United States' sixth house, the house of the servant, to the fifth house, the house of the leader or the king. And it's many times been said of FDR is that he was the one who created the imperial presidency. And it certainly does describe that.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully you can like us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Planetary Calendar Astrology. Give us a like and hit that little bell button, and you'll get reminders every time we post something new, and we're posting all the time.